The Iroquoian or Haudenosaunee tribes, the Mohawk, Oneida, Onondaga, Cayuga, and Seneca, and the Tuscarora, who were reintegrated in the 1700s, were certainly aware of and even traded and intermarried with several Algonquin groups such as the Wampanoag, the Abenaki, the Nipmuc, the Narragansett, the Mohegan, the Pequot, the Penobscot, and more. However, the two cultural groupings had some key differences from each other. The Iroquoian or Haudenosaunee groups farmed the Three Sisters, domesticated corn, beans, and squash, had a complex governing system with roles for elder women and elder men, craft specialization, and sedentism. They lived and still live in massive longhouses with huge village populations. The remains of longhouses that have long rotted away can still be seen in the form of post hole marks in the dirt. We can also see the remains of fortified walls, suggesting warfare at some point. The Haudenosaunee acknowledged that there was a time when they fought amongst each other and were not unified. Then, a man known as the Peacemaker began to preach a message of forgiveness among them. Having lost his entire family, including his children, he had come to realize that vengeance would only continue the cycle of suffering. The Peacemaker was preaching his method around the 1100s, which means that the violent era would most likely describe the Mississippian time period of hierarchy and inequality. The system he developed is still in use today, making the Haudenosaunee the longest-running participatory democracy in the world. He not only developed a ceremony for hearing someone else's pain and sharing your own, culminating in forgiveness, but he also proposed a new organizational structure for the 5 groups. The 5 nations made peace and created the Haudenosaunee Confederacy. They buried their weapons beneath a white pine tree as a symbolic gesture, which is where we get the phrase, "bury the hatchet." This new system for organizing their government had gender-specific roles. There were and still are roles that only women can serve and roles that only men can serve. Elder women are clan mothers and are responsible for choosing male chiefs. However, it should be noted that clan mothers can remove any chief they feel has not fulfilled the role well. For this reason, some people argue that Haudenosaunee society is matriarchal, though others argue it is gender-balanced. Roles are assured for both genders. Men would often address issues outside the villages, while women controlled internal affairs and appointed the men. Europeans dealing with the Haudenosaunee would have dealt primarily with men, which perhaps gave them the idea that men were completely in charge, which was also their own understanding of how genders were supposed to behave. However, if they were allowed to visit Haudenosaunee villages, they would see that women had a lot of official power within both the government and culture. Another interesting development that the Haudenosaunee created was the matrilocal system. The longhouses were occupied through the female line. When a man married a woman, he moved into her family longhouse with her parents, her sisters and their husbands, and any unmarried brothers of hers. This mimics the lack of privacy that foraging has and makes wife battery virtually unthinkable, since the man is surrounded by her relatives. Furthermore, the Haudenosaunee are matrilineal as well. Children take their clan affiliation from their mother. Clans within both Haudenosaunee and Algonquin cultures are like extended families. You cannot marry within your clan, even if you're not directly related to some of them. Each clan serves a traditional function within an indigenous nation and has a symbol that they are responsible for protecting. For example, the Cherokee are a group related to the Haudenosaunee who moved to the southeast. I am Cherokee Wolf Clan and my partner is Cherokee Bird Clan. Wolf Clan typically acts as defenders for the group, and Bird Clan are often peacemakers and politicians. If you think of how much birds chirp, you'll see the link to politics, and in fact, most of our chiefs have actually been Bird Clan. But this also means that I have a responsibility to canines, and I cannot eat them. He has a responsibility to care for birds, and is not supposed to eat them either. What's interesting is that if 2 native nations share a clan, for instance, the Wampanoag have a Wolf Clan, they are also considered family to me, and we're supposed to be hospitable to one another, even though in the past we would have spoken totally different languages. So in the Haudenosaunee nations, children take this very important part of their identity from their mother. Finally, we should take another look at the Haudenosaunee food system. Women were the ones who generally farmed the 3 sisters of corns, beans, and squash. In fact, calling them the 3 sisters tells us a little bit about how these plants are gendered. Because they stayed closer to the villages, women were considered the caretakers of the land. Men generally hunted, so we can see that they actually had a blended system of foraging and farming. And the fact that men were hunting outside the villages further reinforced the notion that women were associated with the home territory and men with areas outside of their immediate territory. This also accounts for some of the health issues associated with farming that Haudenosaunee people do not exhibit. There are some dental issues due to the grinding of corn, but at the time of European contact, historical sources tell us that Haudenosaunee people, both men and women, were quite tall. almost 6 feet for both genders, and were in good physical condition. This is surprising for a farming group, but it's less surprising when we consider their incorporated use of foraging as well. Now let's look at their neighbors, Algonquin groups. Algonquin tribes were generally mobile, moving each season in small groups, lived in short-term housing, and ate mostly wild foods. However, they did some mobile farming of corn, likely traded from the Haudenosaunee tribes, and made decisions based on consensus with respected leaders. They had little to no specialization and very little evidence of warfare prior to the arrival of Europeans. Though they lived in prime farmland, places like the Connecticut River Valley, they never adopted whole-scale farming quite like the Haudenosaunee groups. This tells us that as much as we may appreciate the effects of farming, ancient peoples didn't necessarily see it as a great innovation or one they wanted to totally adopt. Especially in the early days of farming, Algonquins likely saw Haudenosaunee people in that pre-peacemaker era, experiencing hierarchies and violence, as well as the dental issues which the Haudenosaunee did have even after that time period, and the Algonquins probably decided that their lifestyle worked just fine for them. The Algonquin groups do share many of the traits we've come to expect from foraging groups. Government structures were less fixed than the Haudenosaunee ones, and if you didn't like what your group's leader was doing, you could vote with your feet and leave. Women and men could both be group leaders, although meeting Europeans complicated this. When Algonquin women went to meet with Europeans, the Europeans took this as an insult and often refused to speak with them. The Algonquin peoples soon realized that only men would be dealt with, which took power and influence away from their female leaders. Most English writers refuse to even record the names of female leaders among the Algonquin groups, which skews the historical record we have and makes it seem like there were far fewer Algonquin women leaders than there actually were. We do know that women were well respected enough that Metacom, or King Philip, had a sister-in-law named Haudenosaunee who, after her husband and his brother was likely poisoned after being invited to dinner by the English, raised enough young men to start a war over his death. Metacom himself was hesitant to go to war, but Haudenosaunee was prepared to go without him, and her men were prepared to follow her into battle. Today, Algonquin groups still have many women in high positions of their tribal governments. Many of the Algonquin did adopt some corn farming, though they did not become sedentary. Often this corn was stored in case of lean times. Therefore, the Algonquin groups attempted to tap into the security of farming without picking up some of its more negative traits. Their lack of full-scale farming wasn't due to their environment lacking the conditions for it. This decision wasn't a product of environmental determinism, a theory which states that all cultures in similar environments will develop similar structures. The Haudenosaunee and Algonquin peoples were neighbors, but they chose to live in different ways. We have to conclude that there was some human agency or decision-making at work such that the Algonquins did not choose to farm. One thing that the two cultural groups do have in common is that both use blended food systems and consciously tried to gain the benefits and lose the drawbacks of foraging and farming. All of the Algonquin and Iroquoian tribes I discussed, as well as the Muskogee Creek and other descendants of mound-building cultures, all survive as distinct cultural groups today. So especially if you live in the Northeast and don't know much about your indigenous neighbors, I encourage you to check out their cultural centers, museums, events, or even web pages to learn a little bit more about them.